I flew in last night, and thank you for your patience. Sorry about the glitch here. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm delighted the Archdiocese of Philadelphia does so many good things, and this is yet another great example. I was flying in last night from Dallas, and my flight was delayed, and they unfortunately were not very organized about it, and so they had us all on that what do they call it, the long trajectory to board the plane, that hallway. And so we were stacked up there for about 10 minutes. When you're in a place like that, an enclosed place, you hear a lot of things. So I heard a conversation of a number of people who were about 3 people behind me. And this man, young man, kind of a good-looking guy, started joking, flirting with the young women who were just in front of him. He didn't know them. And his opening flirtation was that he had his entire porn collection in his bag, and he hoped it wasn't going to get lost. Now, growing up, if I had heard something like that, I would have shrunk away, wouldn't want to be near that guy. But what struck me was the reaction of the young women. They engaged in this back and forth joking, and the whole conversation became about pornography. And then it went from there to sexual innuendo. And I'm thinking, in the matter of 5 minutes of standing here, this young man, these young women, didn't know each other, but they're engaged in this discussion that was really revolting, but it also it made me sad for the dignity of young women, because I thought, here they are laughing with this young man about his porn collection. And all I could think of was the women who are being exploited in those videos. All I could think about was the attitude that this young man must bring to every relationship because of his immersion in pornography. And yet the women were so conditioned that this was normal, that this was good, that this was something sort of that made them a sophisticated woman to be able to have this kind of conversation. And so it was really disturbing, but it was actually it was a good lead-in to this talk, because I think one of the problems that we're seeing, and we've seen since the beginning, that this whole conversation about contraception is often phrased in terms of it being not just good for women, but essential for women. That women are not going to be independent, women are not going to make the contributions they need to make to society unless it's facilitated by contraception. So much of this problem stems with how women are seeing themselves, how women view themselves. So I want to go back a little bit. Janet did a great kind of history of how we got to where we got in terms of humane vitae and some of the cultural things. But I want to emphasize a few things about the original thinking behind that time period and why contraception was sold as a boon for women. And part of it stemmed from the fact that feminism at that time, there were real problems for women, right? Women were excluded from full participation in society in a way that Pope John Paul II wrote beautifully about, saying, we need women's gifts in the culture, in the workplace, in society. So there were many good things about feminism, opening those doors of opportunity, allowing women to be treated equally in a legal sense. But on a cultural level, what was sold was this idea that women were unhappy and would continue to be unhappy if they embraced motherhood, if they embraced this idea of being in a relationship with a man and valuing that. And so women were sold this idea that in order to be truly happy, we had to be more like men. Our lives needed to look more like men's lives. And what that, as I look back, I think, what a tremendous sense of inferiority women must have had. Instead of saying, like some of the earlier feminists in the 20s and 30s, instead of saying, you know what, we've got something to bring, let us have our voice and be part of things. Instead, they were saying it's not good enough to be a woman. A woman's contribution is only valued if it's like a man's. And that makes me sad, because I think, again, that's just a sense of inferiority underneath that. So what happened? How do you define that happiness? Well, back then, the idea, one of the galvanizing cries was that women were repressed and oppressed, not just because of their roles in the family, but because women couldn't have the same sexual freedom as men. So sexual freedom meant you could have all the sex you want with all the people you want, with no stigma and no consequences. And so that was sold to women as being something that would make you free, mature, and happy. What else? If you're going to think that happiness is sexual freedom, well, you got a little problem when you're talking about women. It makes women's bodies a problem. Because women, unlike men, in our bodies, and I know Vicki will probably go into some more particulars, but just women in our bodies are not set up for multiple, sequential, unconnected sexual relationships. Our fertility all of a sudden became the problem. So instead of looking at women's bodies as a beautiful design, our fertility became a design defect. That somehow we needed technology, we needed contraception to come in and fix us. Because if we wanted sexual freedom, like men, there's something wrong with our bodies, and we got to fix it. So the ideal for women's bodies in terms of sort of sexual freedom became sort of a wombless body. It was chemically as if you didn't have one, so that you could have sex without consequences. And we've seen this idea go beyond the pill to what's promoted now to women is the long-acting, quote, reversible contraception, which is, especially for teenagers, pushed upon girls that if you want to have a sex life at 14, at 15, at 16, your body will betray you. You are likely to get pregnant unless you use these long-acting reversible contraceptions. That means the IUD, putting this thing in you that might migrate, that might perforate your uterus, that has all sorts of side effects. But that's the price of sexual freedom. In reality, contraception actually doesn't work all that well in the sense that it's not a guarantee. So there was a study by the World Health Organization a number of years ago, I think it was 3 or 4 years ago now, that said if you put every single woman who is at risk of unwanted or unintended pregnancy, if you put every single woman on the globe on an IUD or a long-acting contraceptive method, you would still have almost 500,000 unwanted or unexpected pregnancies. Because when you have a failure rate, and people do get pregnant on the IUD, and you multiply that by all the women who are then having sex, you're going to have a lot of unwanted babies. So this whole idea of women's sexual freedom and women's bodies being a problem is only solved really not just by contraception, but by having abortion as a backup. It also didn't pay attention well to how women are built in terms of just our cycles being part of our desire and our hormones facilitating that. And I had an interesting conversation with a woman, a sex therapist actually, who was at Vicki Thorne's conference a couple of years ago on contraception. And I was interviewing her about her work. And she said the first thing they do when a couple comes in with sexual dysfunction is they get them off all hormonal contraception. Why? Because it affects not just your uterus, not just your ovaries, it affects your entire system. So, which I thought was interesting, she was not coming at this from a theological perspective. So what else was the problem for women. Well, it's not just that our bodies are a problem. Well, society and social norms are a problem. Why? Because women are stigmatized unfairly if we embrace this sexual freedom. So part of the whole selling of contraception was selling a different idea of sex to the culture. Selling the idea that it's somehow better, it's somehow more mature, sophisticated, free, happier, to have unconnected, disconnected, uncommitted sexual relationships. And so the ideal that was proposed particularly to young people was this idea that you can have all the sex you want, it's just a physical thing, which we again know theologically that when you take this connection to life-giving away from the love-giving, you end up with not a whole lot of love. And so, but this was being sold. It was like, okay, great, we can take procreation, getting pregnant out of the picture. So now you can have a different kind of sex. It's going to be exciting, it's going to be fun, it's going to be free, because it's going to be uncommitted. It's going to be anytime you want it. And so as Father talked about, these repercussions that we see from that result because women are not made that way. Sex is not designed to be an impersonal transaction. And so one of the reasons why we're seeing things like the whole Me Too movement and this whole issue of sexual consent is because everything's been reduced to just transaction. You know, do I have your consent? No. Yes. No. Okay, go ahead. If not, violation, instead of looking at what sex is meant to be. And just as an aside, there's some interesting research out there about the whole idea of sexual consent, and this is why it's unworkable as sort of more than a minimum. Why it's unworkable in relationships is because relationships are fraught with ambiguity. When you have people who don't know each other, who are having casual sex, that's not how sex is meant to be. When you have a married couple, they know each other, they're interpreting each other, they're in tune with each other. So the sexual act is something different. When you have two people who are approaching each other for selfish purposes, for self-gratification, there's ambiguity because they don't know how to read the other person. They don't know what the signals mean. That's because sex is not designed to be like that. And sex like that also doesn't take into account the natural ambivalence. Imagine women opening up the most vulnerable part of you to a stranger or a virtual stranger or someone who doesn't love you. That's a really risky place to be. And yet women from the 60s, 70s, and particularly through the 80s and 90s were really pushed into this idea that that was somehow freeing and empowering. You could own your sexuality so much that you could just be free to be sexy with anybody. And yet what that didn't take into account, and what we're seeing with all the Me Too stories coming out, is that women often have ambivalence in those situations, understandably. They get into it and they think, what am I doing? Or he's ugly, or I don't want to be here, but I don't know how to tell him. And women are stuck because of these expectations that sex is supposed to be something different from what it is. And women have believed that. And that's been part of what has constrained women for so long. So another part of this lie that women were fed is that if we want to be like men, if happiness looks like men's lives, then we define happiness in terms of career and financial success. And there's a problem. Women get pregnant. And so babies become the problem. Not just our bodies, but babies become the problem. So this whole contraceptive push and this idea of holding up for women the ideal that you're really not happy unless you have a career path that mimics a man's, unless you have the financial success, the retirement account, the 401k that looks just like a man's, that somehow you're unhappy, well then babies are the problem. And so we see that in the rhetoric that we hear today. I follow these issues all the time, so I've got all these Google alerts and different things. And it's almost weekly that there's a study or an article coming out with the rhetoric saying women are behind, women are failing, women are falling short because our career or lifetime earnings don't match a man's, because our retirement accounts don't match a man's, because of all these things that have been held up to women as being the model of happiness. And in fact, we see this even in the law. So in 1992, the case Planned Parenthood versus Casey was the one that reaffirmed Roe v. Wade. But the rhetoric in there is interesting because it's very much more reflecting this sociological change that went along with the contraceptive revolution, where it said, talking about abortion, but again, abortion is the necessary backup for contraception. So the justice who wrote the opinion said, for decades now, in 1992, people have organized their intimate relationships and their lives in reliance on the availability of contraception and abortion as a backup if contraception should fail. So this conditioning has a result, so much so that the law says, we don't want to disturb that. What's striking about that is if you think back to, not that we were alive then, but if you read about the arguments made around the time of the Civil War, and when people talked about slavery, one of the arguments made to justify the continuation of slavery, at least in the South, was that the economy's been organized around this. People's lives, their families, their plantations, their history, it's been organized around the availability of slave labor. So we cannot disrupt that. It's the very same thinking in the court's opinion in 1992. What Planned Parenthood versus Casey also said, and this is the key piece that's been picked up for the past 20 years, is that women cannot participate equally in society without contraception and abortion as a backup. So the goalpost sort of moved. It's not just your happiness and your career and financial success. Now it's basic equality, that you cannot be a fully participating, if you're a woman, a fully participating member of society unless you have contraception and abortion as a backup. And that is what I encounter continually when I often go to law schools and talk about abortion law and things like that. The conversations I have with women, young women afterwards, they usually don't want to raise their hand and ask something that's at all sympathetic to the pro-life position. They usually don't want to do that in front of everyone. But afterwards, I have these conversations. And their dilemma is this. They say, how can I do it all? I need contraception. I need abortion. Because otherwise, I can't be on the partnership track. Otherwise, I can't be free to do X, Y, and Z. I'm not equal as society measures equality. So women have really taken that myth to heart. But what we've seen, the result, is that women, instead of being empowered and freed by all of this, have been exploited. And yet we're told that this is somehow for our good, that this is somehow better for us. And I had an interesting conversation with a young male college student. We were talking about the whole Me Too movement and sexual consent and things. And he said, it's been a really great thing for guys up until now, because you could have sex and have one-night stands, and of course the girls are available and you don't think twice. But now with the Me Too movement, he said, all the guys I know who've had one-night stands are now scared stiff that someone's going to come out and say, I really felt pressured, or that was sexual assault. So men are failed by this too, because it's all a lie. But at any rate, the exploitation that's inherent in contraception is carried out now in ways that are magnified. And we really see that with the explosion of pornography, as I mentioned with that incident in the little gateway to the plane. But women's own attitudes have been changing. And I see this pushed in women's magazines, on TV shows, where women are being sort of told, it's part of the script, it's part of the cultural script now, that women should embrace pornography. It can be good for your relationship. And in some of the interviews I've done with young women, most of them will watch pornography in order to please their boyfriend or their husband. In other words, they're not typically, if they're in a relationship, they're not saying, woohoo, I can't wait to just dial something up and look at it all by myself. Women tend to be relational. And so this becomes something that they think is going to improve their relationship. And yet there's an increasing amount of research now as people are realizing the great propensity for porn to produce addiction. There's a great amount of research, and there was a study that came out earlier this year that was talking about the decline in marital quality is measurable when you introduce porn into the relationship. And they said it is especially true for young marriages and young women, that there's something about that changes the dynamic of the marriage relationship. So again, it's a myth that's being sold to women, but women, this is all women are hearing in the culture. So Father also mentioned the 50 Shades of Grey, and that's another, it's true, women made that a bestseller. Women would flock with their girlfriends to go see the movies. You go into women's stores and you'll see these things that are sort of reminiscent about bondage and things like that in terms of the advertising. And so again, why is it that women are so willing to believe this, that this is good? But it goes along with this whole idea that when you separate out procreation from sexuality, when your body is just a thing to be used, it's different from sort of the real you. Well, why shouldn't you try something? What difference does it make? And yet what happens to our bodies happens to us because we're a unity of body and soul. But again, that's not something, especially in this culture of gender identity determining everything, our bodies are sort of disassociated from ourselves. And women are particularly vulnerable to that. That little picture with the I love fries and the consent, that's a Planned Parenthood ad, but one of the sort of sad but kind of hilarious things that I see now on college campuses is they have these consent contracts, right? They in many college campuses, to avoid the problem of sexual assault, which is a real problem, women are vulnerable, is that now you're supposed to get affirmative consent, get a yes at every step of the way. And there are these little kits, I don't know whether it's facetious or not, but they're out there that you can sign before you engage in any activity. And all I can think of is, on a human level, what a romance killer. But if you're not used to thinking of sexuality as this intimate experience, this giving and receiving with someone you love, if it's just this mechanical thing to get pleasure, well, you take a very mechanical, technological approach to things, and you wonder why you're unhappy. And that's one of the interesting things, too, in the research. Again, some people are doing some interesting research. At least they're asking questions that they didn't ask 20 years ago. Is there regret after women hook up? No surprise, of course. Of course. And the regret is much higher for women than it is for men. But men experience regret, too. It's over half for women. It's like 56% or something. For men, it's down to 28 or something like that, those who will say from the outset that they regret a one-night stand. But what was interesting to me is in this research, it was talking about the reason why. Why do they regret? For women, the number one reason why they regret sexual hookups, which again are made possible only by contraception, number one reason is they feel used. The number one reason why men regret sexual hookups is because they regret using someone. Because it's built into us. If you've got a heart, if you're a person, there's something in you that says human beings are not made to be treated like things. Human beings should be treated with love. They're not meant to be used and thrown away. And yet that's exactly what happens in these encounters that are inherently exploitative. And this, again, just one more word about consent. Consent is a minimum, a legal minimum. It doesn't prevent exploitation because you can never consent to being treated like an object. That's why pornography is morally wrong. Even if the woman says, hey, I love this job. And you will find some sex workers who will be out in front saying that. Although if you look at their life histories, it's clear. It's not that they had a job at Morgan Stanley and they had, all these other options and said, oh, I think I'll go be a sex worker because it looks like fun. They're impelled by other life circumstances. But even if you have this apparent permission or this woman with this enthusiastic yes, she's giving a yes to be exploited. Your dignity cannot be alienated like that. You have an inalienable dignity. Each one of us made in the image and likeness of God. And that means we need to be treated with love, not as objects. So we cannot give permission for someone to treat us like a thing and have that person feel like, I have no moral guilt. They said yes. You cannot exploit another person. Just as you couldn't say, hey, can I chop off your arm? Yeah, sure, go ahead. It would still be wrong for you to chop off the person's arm. So this idea that a human being has this dignity that cannot be violated gets lost in this message about what sex is. The culture, too, has this whole culture facilitated by contraception has been terrible for women's bodies. And I know Vicki will go into a lot of that, so I won't go into the details here. But just to say, it is absolutely a lie that contraception is somehow good for women's bodies. And interestingly enough, there's an increasing interest in women just for holistic reasons, for health reasons, to get rid of using contraception. And that was one of the things I found when I did that survey in 2012. There's the numbers of women who fully accept the church's teaching are small. The numbers of women who absolutely outright reject it because they just don't believe it or they reject the church's teaching, that's not that big either. It's like about a quarter. There's a mushy middle that's kind of open. They don't know enough. They need to understand why it's good for them to approach sex differently and to appreciate their fertility as a gift, to see it in the context of a relationship. But they're persuadable, and the big opening is this whole idea of what's good for your body, that you are a unity of body and soul. It has to be good for your body, and contraception is not. And then we see, of course, the emotional consequences. The women who feel lonely, who want a relationship and can't find one. I had a sad conversation in the hair salon about a year ago. A woman was talking about yet another guy that she was dating, the hairdresser. And she said, but now I know. I've figured out what's a problem when you start dating a guy. I've realized my mistake. And I thought she was going to say she was having sex too soon. But she said, you can't start cooking for them or they start expecting it. I'm thinking, okay, you'll sleep with him, but you don't want to cook with him because, so I don't know. Anyway, but women's expectations then are unmet. Most women still want to get married and have a family. That's hard to do when your whole approach to relationships is different. It's hard to do when you don't make room in your life to build a relationship with the idea that when you get married, you're going to have children and that that's a gift. Because again, the way of thinking about babies is now it's a burden. It's not a gift. It's not a manifestation of this amazing, unique, unrepeatable person that grew out of your love. It's, oh my gosh, we have a kid, now what? Daycare, what do I do? It's like problem. All of this is sold to women as a problem. And women's career goals, we're still, here we are, 2018. Women have been in the workforce to a great degree for decades now, and we're still having these conversations about women burning out and women not being able to do it all and all this stuff. And just this constant pressure on women that you're behind, you're failing, you're not good enough. Instead of saying, whoa, wait a minute, there are phases to women's lives. It is a huge, wonderful blessing to be able to be a mom. Can we open up our workplaces to accommodate that in a way that says this is a good thing? Yes, we want, as John Paul II said, we want women's contributions in the culture, in the workplace. But we need women as women, not women whose bodies have been neutered so they can work like a man. And it's interesting when you look at maternity and paternity policies, there's an effort to equalize everything. You have a new baby, you as a couple get a year. Hopes will be the woman takes 6 months, the guy will take 6 months. That neglects the reality that the woman went through labor. She's got a newborn that, hopefully she's able to nurse, that baby needs bonding. And the whole conversation is always, what do women need? What do women want? It's not what children need. Instead of seeing it as when you create a family, you have responsibilities and obligations to this new little person who's been created. So I would suggest that for pro-life men and women to think seriously about how we value women's contributions, how we make room for women as women, that our career paths are not going to look the same, our work patterns are not going to look the same, but our contributions are valuable nonetheless and need to be included. So what's the solution here? Sexual integrity. First, each person understanding who they are. John Paul II wrote that when men exploit women, it's not just that women are harmed, men are harmed too. And so we need to realize each person is equal in dignity. The contraception violates that human dignity, and it undercuts and destroys that relationship, or at least has the potential. I found in doing my survey research, a lot of women, one person who does a lot of work on theology of the body had said to me, I think you're going to have a lot of women saying in contraceptive marriages they feel used and they don't like it. Surprisingly, there was not a high percentage of women who felt that because they're used to sex being something different. So they're approaching things in a different way. Doesn't mean they're satisfied with how things go, but they don't necessarily have the insight to see what is wrong in the dynamic. So how do we change this? What do we do? First, as women, be happy to be a woman. No, let's not reject our femininity. Let's not reject motherhood. It is such a gift. And for men, value that. Encourage that in your daughters. I talk to young women all the time, and they talk about how wonderful it is that their dads encourage their career aspirations. And that's great. But encourage them to value being a mom, to value having a marriage and building a life together with someone. That love is what it's all about. It's not the size of your bank account. It's not the titles that follow your name. It's love, and that's built in relationships. So I'll leave you with just a thought about some words from John Paul II in the document he wrote on the lay Christian faithful. He talked about women having two tasks in particular, and one was to witness to the integrity of the conjugal life, marriage and family, the value of marriage and family. And the second, he said that women need to shape the moral dimension of culture. And that is one reason why I do the work that I do. But that's one reason why, for Catholic women, we need to embrace our dignity as women, we need to embrace our vocation, and we need to go out and to shape the moral dimension of culture. So thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Monica Ashauer, Executive Director of Tobit, the Theology of the Body Evangelization Team. We are glad that you're inquiring about The Body Matters. My team and I present to you a great resource as you form children in the truth of love, the truth of the person, and the truth of the body, being made in God's image and likeness. Let's take a look at how the body matters. In a culture that seeks to brainwash children in ways contrary to the truth of being human, and thus contrary to the gospel, The Body Matters is upstream. That is, reaching children early so that they know who they are in Jesus Christ. Without any explicit reference to cultural indoctrination, we present the truth in a wholesome and age-appropriate way in our lesson books. Children love our original illustrations and unique perspective on the time-honored teachings of the Catholic faith, based on St. John Paul's theology of the body. Help us give this teaching to a world in need. For more information, please contact us at tobit.org. That's TOBET.org.